Commander Veltar adjusted his observation screen and smiled with satisfaction. 300 years of studying war across the galaxy had taught him everything there was to know about conflict. His species, the Kethmori, were the best military observers in known space. They watched, they recorded, and they understood how different races fought their battles. The blue planet called Earth had finally caught his attention. Long-range sensors showed that these humans had just discovered faster-than-light travel. Their ships looked basic but functional. Their weapons seemed standard for a new spacefaring race. Everything about them screamed ordinary. Veltar had seen this pattern dozens of times before. A young species takes its first steps into space, discovers they are not alone, and then learns how real warfare works. Some species focused on honor and tradition. Others relied on superior technology or numbers. A few tried to use clever tactics, but in the end, war always followed predictable patterns. His ship, the Silent Watcher, moved closer to Earth's solar system. The vessel was designed to remain hidden while gathering information. For 3 centuries, Veltar had used it to study conflicts between over 200 different civilizations. His reports were read by military leaders across the galaxy. The first human ship appeared on his sensors exactly when he expected it. The vessel looked crude compared to most galactic standards, but it showed clear military design. Angular hull, weapon ports in logical positions, and shield generators that hummed with familiar energy signatures. Nothing surprising at all. Captain Jake Morrison commanded the human ship called Defiance. Veltar listened to their communications and found them refreshingly direct. No flowery diplomatic language or ancient ritual greetings, just simple, clear messages asking for peaceful contact. Unknown vessel. This is Captain Morrison of the United Earth ship Defiance. We come in peace and request communication. Veltar activated his translation systems and responded. Greetings, Captain Morrison. I am Commander Veltar of the Kethmori Confederation. We welcome you to galactic civilization. The conversation that followed was entirely predictable. The humans wanted to know about other species, galactic politics, and trade opportunities. They asked about threats and conflicts. They seemed cautious but curious, exactly like most new spacefaring races. Colonel Lisa Hayes served as the military advisor aboard the Defiance. Veltar watched her closely during the talks. She maintained standard defensive positions and asked sensible questions about galactic military customs. Her behavior showed proper training and reasonable intelligence, but nothing exceptional. We understand there are conflicts between different species, Hayes said during one of their meetings. We would like to know what to expect. Veltar explained the basics. War in space follows certain patterns, Colonel. Most conflicts involve either territorial disputes, resource competition, or ideological differences. Advanced species have developed sophisticated weapons and tactics over thousands of years. New species usually need time to learn these methods. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. And what advice would you give to a species like ours? Study the successful civilizations. Learn their tactics. Develop better technology. Most importantly, understand that space warfare is vastly different from planetary conflicts. The scales are larger, the weapons more powerful, and the consequences more severe. The human military officer thanked him for the information. Veltar noticed she took careful notes but asked no unusual questions. Everything about her approach seemed standard for a competent but inexperienced commander. Over the following weeks, Veltar observed human military exercises through his sensors. Their formations were basic but solid. Their weapon tests showed reasonable power levels for their technology base. Their tactical drills followed patterns he had seen many times before. The humans seemed to favor direct approaches over subtle strategies. They liked simple plans that could be easily understood and quickly executed. Their communication systems were efficient but not particularly sophisticated. Their ships moved in predictable formations that any experienced commander could counter. Veltar began preparing his initial report on humanity. He classified them as a standard emerging military power with moderate potential. Their technology would improve over time. Their tactics would become more sophisticated as they gained experience. In a few hundred years, they might become a respectable minor power in galactic politics. Species designation human, he dictated to his recording system. Classification, standard carbon-based military development. Technology level, basic spacefaring. Tactical approach, direct engagement preferred over complex strategies. Threat assessment, minimal to moderate in long-term development. Recommendation: routine monitoring with updates every 50 years. The humans invited him to visit their ship for a formal dinner. Veltar accepted, curious to observe their social customs. The meal was simple but well prepared. The conversation focused on trade possibilities and cultural exchange. Captain Morrison asked intelligent questions about galactic history and politics. "We know we have a lot to learn," Morrison admitted. "Our species has always been good at adapting, but space is obviously very different from what we're used to." "Adaptation is important," Veltar agreed. "The species that survive and prosper are those that can change their methods when necessary. Rigid thinking leads to defeat." Colonel Hayes joined the conversation. "What would you say is the most important lesson for a new military power?" Veltar considered the question. "Understand your enemies before you fight them. Every species has strengths and weaknesses. Successful commanders learn to exploit weaknesses while avoiding strengths. But remember, your enemies are also studying you." The dinner ended pleasantly. Veltar returned to his ship satisfied that he understood these humans completely. They were polite, reasonably intelligent, and properly cautious. Given time and experience, they might develop into competent warriors. But they offered nothing new or surprising. As his ship prepared to leave the solar system, Veltar took one last look at Earth. The blue planet looked peaceful from space, with white clouds swirling over brown and green continents. Hard to believe that such a quiet world had produced a spacefaring civilization. His sensors detected several more human ships moving through the system. All showed the same basic design principles and predictable behavior patterns. Military vessels maintaining standard patrol routes. Cargo ships following efficient but obvious flight paths. Nothing that suggested any unique or innovative thinking. Veltar filed his report and set course for his next assignment. The galaxy was full of conflicts worth studying, and he had already spent too much time on this unremarkable species. Humans might become important someday, but that day was clearly far in the future. He had no way of knowing that in just a few months, everything he thought he understood about warfare would be proven completely wrong. The humans he had dismissed as ordinary were about to show the galaxy something it had never seen before. But for now, Veltar was confident in his assessment. After 3 centuries of studying war, he believed he had seen everything there was to see. 3 months after his first meeting with humanity, Veltar received an emergency alert that changed everything. The message came from the Galactic Defense Council, marked with the highest priority codes he had seen in decades. All observation vessels report to designated safe zones immediately. The Zephyrian Empire has begun full-scale military operations against galactic civilization. This is not a drill. Veltar felt his blood turn cold. The Zephyrians were the nightmare that every spacefaring species feared, but hoped they would never face. They were a hive-minded race that had already conquered 73 worlds across the galaxy. Their bioships could change and adapt in real time during battle. Their warriors felt no fear, no pain, and no mercy. What made the Zephyrians truly terrifying was their perfect coordination. Every ship, every soldier, every weapon moved as part of a single massive intelligence. They could learn from every battle instantly and share that knowledge across their entire military. No tactic worked against them twice. Veltar positioned his observation ship near the outer colony of Haven's Ridge, where intelligence reports suggested the first major battle would take place. His sensors detected massive fleet movements as the galaxy's great powers rushed to defend civilization. The Althari Republic sent their finest battle cruisers, ships that had never known defeat in 300 years of warfare. The Nexus Coalition deployed their advanced drone swarms, controlled by the most sophisticated artificial intelligences in known space. The Draconic Hegemony brought their massive dreadnoughts, each one capable of destroying entire planets. It was the largest military force Veltar had ever seen assembled. Over 2,000 ships from dozens of different species, all working together to stop the Zephyrian advance. Their combined firepower could have shattered moons, but when the Zephyrian fleet arrived, Veltar understood why the galaxy was afraid. The enemy ships looked alive because they were alive. Massive bioforms that pulsed with organic energy, covered in what looked like scales or shells that shifted and changed color. Some resembled giant sea creatures from ocean worlds. Others looked like insects blown up to impossible size. All of them moved with fluid grace that no mechanical ship could match. The first engagement began exactly as military doctrine predicted. The Galactic Alliance formed standard battle lines, with heavy ships in the center and faster vessels on the flanks. Their most powerful weapons charged up for coordinated volleys that should have devastated any normal fleet. The Zephyrian response was immediate and terrifying. Their bioships split apart like living cells dividing, turning one large target into dozens of smaller ones. The Alliance's carefully aimed shots hit empty space or struck ships that suddenly grew thick armor plating in exactly the right locations. Veltar watched in fascination as the enemy adapted in real time. When the Althari used their famous plasma cannons, the Zephyrian ships sprouted reflective surfaces that bounced the energy back at the attackers. When the Nexus Coalition deployed their drone swarms, the bioships released clouds of smaller organisms that hunted down and destroyed each drone. Within hours, the Alliance fleet was in full retreat. Hundreds of ships had been destroyed or captured. The survivors fled in disorder, their perfect formations broken and their confidence shattered. During the chaos of the retreat, Veltar detected familiar energy signatures approaching the battle zone. 3 human ships had arrived, led by Captain Morrison's Defiance. Behind them came a larger vessel broadcasting Admiral's codes. Admiral Ryan Carter commanded the human fleet from his flagship, the Liberty. With him was General Amy Foster, who had been given command of all human military forces outside Earth's solar system. Veltar listened to their communications with growing interest. Admiral Carter to Alliance Command, the human leader transmitted, "Earth forces request permission to join the defense effort." The response came from Admiral Corvash of the Althari Republic, his voice heavy with exhaustion and defeat. "Human forces, we appreciate your courage, but this enemy is beyond anything you have encountered. They adapt to every weapon, every tactic. Your ships would be destroyed in minutes." "We understand the risk," Carter replied calmly, "but we have experience with unconventional warfare. Perhaps we can contribute something useful." There was a long pause before Corvash responded. "Admiral Carter, your species has been in space for mere decades. We have fought wars for thousands of years and we cannot stop these creatures. I admire your bravery, but I will not send you to certain death." General Foster's voice joined the conversation. "Sir, with respect, Earth has been fighting wars a lot longer than we've been in space. We might see something you've missed." Veltar found the human confidence puzzling. He had observed their military capabilities just months before. They were competent but hardly exceptional. Their technology was basic compared to the Alliance powers. Their tactics were simple and direct. What could they possibly do that the galaxy's finest warriors could not? The Alliance commanders finally agreed to let the humans serve in a support role, far from the main battle zones. They would evacuate civilians and carry supplies, but they were forbidden from engaging the enemy directly. It was clearly meant to keep them safe while giving them something useful to do. Admiral Carter accepted the assignment without complaint. But Veltar noticed something in his tone that suggested the humans had their own plans. General Foster's response was even more interesting. "Understood, Alliance Command. Human forces will comply with all safety protocols. But if the situation changes, we reserve the right to defend ourselves and our allies." Over the following weeks, Veltar watched the war spread across the galaxy. Every major battle ended the same way. The Alliance would deploy their best strategies and most advanced weapons. The Zephyrians would adapt and counter everything within hours. More worlds fell to the hive mind's advance. The enemy seemed to understand not just the Alliance's technology, but their thinking patterns as well. When the Althari tried to use their honor-based combat traditions, the Zephyrians exploited their predictable behavior. When the Nexus Coalition attempted committee-based tactical decisions, the enemy struck during their debates. When the Draconic hegemony refused to retreat out of pride, entire fleets were surrounded and destroyed. Meanwhile, the human ships continued their support missions, staying far from combat zones and following all safety regulations, but Veltar noticed they were also observing everything. Their sensor arrays were constantly active, recording every battle and analyzing every Zephyrian adaptation. Captain Morrison's crew seemed particularly interested in the enemy's psychological warfare tactics. The Zephyrians had learned to use each species' cultural weaknesses against them. They knew exactly how to break Alliance morale and coordination. "These creatures are smart," Colonel Hayes observed during one of their recorded discussions, "but they're also predictable in their own way. They always adapt using the same basic process. They study, they learn, they counter. It's efficient, but it's also a pattern. Every pattern has weaknesses, General Foster replied. We just need to find the right approach. Veltar wondered what the humans thought they could accomplish. Their ships were still outnumbered thousands to one. Their weapons were still primitive compared to Alliance standards. Their tactical experience was still limited to their home system. But something about their calm confidence troubled him. After 3 centuries of studying war, he had learned to recognize dangerous opponents. The Zephyrians were obviously dangerous because of their overwhelming power and adaptability, but the humans were dangerous in a different way, one he couldn't quite identify. As more Alliance fleets fell to the advancing hive mind, Veltar began to suspect that the galaxy was about to learn something new about warfare, something that might come from the most unlikely source imaginable. The humans were planning something, and despite their apparent disadvantages, Veltar was starting to think the Zephyrians might not be ready for whatever it was. 6 months into the war, Veltar had filled dozens of data files with recordings of defeat after defeat. The Zephyrian advance seemed unstoppable. Every time the Galactic Alliance tried a new strategy, the hive mind learned and adapted faster than anyone thought possible. The numbers were horrifying. 18 star systems had fallen completely. Over 300 worlds were either destroyed or converted into Zephyrian breeding grounds. Millions of civilians had been killed or transformed into mindless drones. The galaxy's greatest military powers were running out of ships, soldiers, and hope. Veltar studied the battle recordings from his observation post, trying to understand how such advanced civilizations could be failing so completely. The Althari Republic had military traditions stretching back 10,000 years. The Nexus Coalition commanded artificial intelligences that could process information faster than any biological mind. The Draconic Hegemony possessed weapons that could crack planets in half. Yet none of it mattered against an enemy that could change itself to counter every advantage. The pattern was always the same. Alliance forces would arrive at a battle zone with careful plans based on previous Zephyrian behavior. The enemy would respond exactly as expected for the first few minutes. Then the bioships would begin adapting, and within an hour, every Alliance advantage would become a weakness. When the Althari tried to use their famous honor duels between champion pilots, the Zephyrians simply ignored the challenges and attacked support vessels instead. When the Nexus Coalition deployed their smartest battle computers, the enemy learned to jam their communication networks and turn the artificial minds against each other. When the Draconic Hegemony brought their most powerful weapons, the bioships developed armor that absorbed the energy and grew stronger. But it was worse than just technological adaptation. The Zephyrians seemed to understand the psychology of every species they fought. They knew exactly how to break enemy morale and destroy battlefield coordination. They could predict cultural responses and exploit traditional weaknesses with surgical precision. The emergency council meeting was held aboard Haven's Rest, a massive space station that served as neutral ground for diplomatic talks. Representatives from every major power attended, along with observers from dozens of minor species. The mood was desperate. Admiral Korvash of the Althari Republic looked decades older than he had at the war's beginning. We have lost 40% of our battle fleet. Our best commanders are dead or missing. Our remaining forces are demoralized and scattered. Minister Thylan from the Nexus Coalition was equally grim. Our artificial intelligences cannot match the speed of Zephyrian adaptation. Every tactical model we create becomes obsolete within hours of implementation. We are fighting an enemy that learns faster than we can think. Grand Marshal Korath of the Draconic Hegemony slammed his massive fist on the council table. Our pride has become our weakness. These creatures know we will never retreat, so they trap us in hopeless battles. Our honor demands we fight to the death, and they use that against us. The smaller species had similar stories. Every military tradition, every tactical doctrine, every strategic advantage had been turned into a liability by an enemy that understood them better than they understood themselves. That was when Admiral Carter requested permission to address the council. The human officer had been sitting quietly in the observer section, listening to the reports with his senior staff. General Foster sat beside him, along with several officers Veltar hadn't seen before. Honorable council members, Carter began, Earth formally requests permission to participate directly in combat operations. The response was immediate and negative. Admiral Korvash spoke for the entire council. Admiral Carter, we respect your courage, but your species lacks the experience to face this threat. We have lost thousands of advanced warships. Your entire fleet would not last an hour against the Zephyrians. General Foster stood and spoke calmly. Respectfully, sir, we think you might be approaching this problem wrong. The council chamber fell silent. For a new species to suggest that civilizations with thousands of years of military experience were making mistakes seemed either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Explain. Grand Marshal Korath growled. Foster gestured to one of her staff officers. Colonel Pete Williams has studied every battle recording we could access. His analysis suggests the Zephyrians aren't invincible. They're just fighting opponents who think like they do. Colonel Williams activated a holographic display showing Zephyrian battle patterns. The enemy adapts by studying and countering whatever they face. But their adaptation process follows logical patterns. They expect logical responses. Every species here fights with reasonable tactics, careful planning, and predictable cultural behaviors. Are you suggesting we fight unreasonably? Minister Thylan asked. We're suggesting you fight like humans. Major Kate Brooks replied from her seat near the back of the chamber. We've been observing these creatures for months. They're brilliant at countering sophisticated strategies, but we don't think they know how to handle chaos. Admiral Corvash shook his head. Chaos is not a military strategy. It's a path to certain defeat. Commander Steve Parker spoke up. With respect, sir, your certain strategies have led to certain defeat anyway. Maybe it's time to try something uncertain. Veltar found himself fascinated by the human approach. They weren't claiming superior technology or ancient wisdom. They were suggesting that inexperience might actually be an advantage against an enemy that learned by studying experience. The debate continued for hours. The established powers argued that military tradition and proven doctrine were humanity's only hope for survival. The humans quietly insisted that tradition and doctrine were exactly what the Zephyrians were designed to defeat. Finally, desperation won over pride. The Council agreed to allow limited human participation in the next major defensive action. They would be assigned to secondary objectives and given support roles, but they would finally be allowed to engage the enemy directly. Admiral Carter accepted the decision with grace. Thank you for this opportunity. We won't waste it. As the council meeting ended, Veltar noticed something interesting. The human officers didn't seem relieved or grateful for their chance to prove themselves. They seemed confident, as if they had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. General Foster gathered her staff for a private briefing in their assigned quarters. Veltar managed to intercept some of their communications, and what he heard made him think the humans had been planning for this moment since the war began. Remember, the key is unpredictability, Foster told her officers. Everything we do has to be something the enemy has never seen before. No standard formations, no traditional tactics, no reasonable responses to logical situations. What if we're wrong? Colonel Williams asked. What if chaos just gets us killed faster? Foster smiled grimly. Then we'll die doing something new instead of dying doing something that's already failed 100 times. Veltar realized that the humans weren't just offering to help fight the Zephyrians. They were preparing to test a completely different approach to warfare, an approach based on abandoning everything that previous military science considered wise or effective. For the first time in 6 months, he felt something other than despair about the war's outcome. The humans might be completely wrong about their unconventional theories, but they might also be about to show the galaxy that there was more than one way to think about conflict. Either way, Veltar was certain that the next battle would be unlike anything he had observed in 3 centuries of studying war. The humans were about to prove whether experience was a strength or a weakness when facing an enemy that learned from experience. The galaxy was about to discover if chaos could triumph where logic had failed. The Battle of Kepler Station began like every other disaster the galaxy had witnessed over the past 6 months. The massive space station served as the Alliance's last major stronghold in the outer territories. If it fell, the Zephyrians would have a clear path to the core, worlds where billions of civilians waited in terror. Veltar positioned his observation ship at maximum safe distance and prepared to record what everyone expected would be another crushing defeat. The Alliance had assembled their remaining forces in a desperate defensive formation around the station. 300 ships from a dozen different species, all that remained of fleets that had once numbered in the thousands. The Zephyrian attack force was smaller, but far more terrifying. Only 50 bioships approached the station, but each one was the size of a city and covered in organic weapons that pulsed with deadly energy. Veltar had watched these living vessels adapt and overcome every defense the galaxy could devise. Admiral Corvash commanded the Alliance fleet from his flagship, following defensive doctrine that had been developed over centuries of warfare. Heavy cruisers formed the outer shell of protection around Kepler Station. Fast attack craft waited in reserve for flanking maneuvers. Support vessels stayed safely behind the main battle line. It was a textbook defensive formation that any military academy would have praised. It was also exactly the kind of predictable strategy that had failed against the Zephyrians dozens of times before. The enemy bioships approached in their usual pattern, moving like a living organism rather than a mechanical fleet. They tested the Alliance defenses with probing attacks, learning and adapting to every weapon and tactic they encountered. Within minutes, they had analyzed the defensive formation and begun developing countermeasures. That was when something unprecedented happened. 4 human ships broke away from the main Alliance formation and began moving in patterns that made no sense to any observer. Captain Morrison's Defiance led the small human force, but instead of joining the defensive line, his ships scattered in apparently random directions. They moved at different speeds, changed course without warning, and seemed to ignore every principle of coordinated fleet action. Human vessels, return to formation immediately, Admiral Corvash ordered over the communication channels. You are compromising the defensive integrity. Negative, Alliance Command, Morrison replied calmly. We are implementing asymmetric harassment protocol. Please maintain standard defensive positions while we engage the enemy. Veltar watched in amazement as the human ships began what could only be described as guerrilla warfare in space. Commander Williams in the Resilience made a high-speed attack run on one of the larger bioships, fired a brief barrage of weapons, then immediately retreated before the enemy could respond. Major Brooks in the Courage attacked a different target from an unexpected angle, used weapons the Zephyrians had never encountered before, then fled in a direction that made no tactical sense. The enemy bioships tried to adapt to these attacks, but there was nothing to adapt to. Each human assault was completely different from the last. They used different weapons, different approaches, different retreat patterns. There was no logic for the Zephyrian hive mind to analyze and counter. Commander Parker in the Defiant took the most extreme approach. His ship loaded its cargo bay with crude chemical explosives and ballistic weapons that looked like museum pieces compared to standard galactic technology. Then he did something that horrified every observer. He rammed his ship directly into one of the bio-vessels and began fighting inside the living hull. What is he doing? Admiral Corvash demanded. Those weapons are primitive. They will be ineffective against bio-armor. But Parker's primitive weapons were exactly why they worked. The Zephyrian bio-ship had adapted to counter-energy weapons, plasma cannons, and smart missiles. It had never encountered gunpowder explosives and steel bullets. Its adaptive systems, confused by technology that was thousands of years obsolete, failed to develop proper defenses. The bioship began convulsing as Parker's team fought their way through its organic corridors using weapons that relied on chemical reactions instead of advanced physics. The Zephyrian adaptation process, designed to counter sophisticated threats, couldn't handle something so primitive and unexpected. Meanwhile, the other human ships continued their chaotic attacks. They broadcast random signals that confused the hive mind's communication systems. They used psychological warfare tactics that made no sense to a species that shared a collective consciousness. They employed deception and misdirection in ways that logical military minds couldn't predict or counter. Most shocking to Veltar was the humans' approach to casualties. When Commander Parker's ship was damaged beyond repair inside the bio-vessel, he didn't retreat or surrender. Instead, he timed his ship's destruction to cause maximum damage to the enemy. His sacrifice wasn't the noble, honor-bound death that other species preferred. It was a calculated tactical decision designed to create chaos in the Zephyrian formation. The effect was immediate and devastating. The bioship that Parker had infected began broadcasting confused signals to the rest of the hive mind. Its adaptive systems, poisoned by incomprehensible human tactics, started sending contradictory information to other vessels. The perfect coordination that made the Zephyrians so dangerous began to break down. General Foster's voice came over the communication channels, directing her scattered forces with orders that sounded like organized madness. Brooks hit the third bioship from below using the old combustion torpedoes. Williams, make a false retreat toward the station, then circle back with the electromagnetic pulse weapons. Morrison, prepare for ramming attack on my signal. General, Admiral Corvash interrupted. These tactics are completely irregular. You're ignoring every principle of space combat. Yes, sir, Foster replied cheerfully. That's exactly the point. The battle turned into something Veltar had never seen before. The Alliance fleet maintained their defensive positions, following tried and tested military doctrine. The human ships danced around the edges of the battle, creating chaos and confusion wherever they went. The Zephyrian bioships, designed to adapt to logical threats, began making mistakes as they tried to counter tactics that made no sense. One bioship tried to adapt to Morrison's ramming attack by developing stronger armor, but Morrison never actually rammed it. He pulled away at the last second and hit a different target with weapons that had been disguised as engine exhaust. Another bioship prepared to counter Brooks's electronic warfare systems, but she switched to primitive radio broadcasts that overwhelmed their communication networks with human music and poetry. The hive mind's perfect coordination became a weakness as confused. Information spread through their network. Bioships that had adapted to counter specific human tactics found themselves using those adaptations against other Zephyrian vessels. The enemy fleet began attacking itself as their shared consciousness became poisoned with contradictory data. Within hours, the Zephyrian attack force was in full retreat. For the first time since the war began, the alien invaders had been not just stopped but decisively defeated. The bioships fled in disorder, their adaptive systems overloaded by encounters with tactics they couldn't understand or counter. As the human ships regrouped near Kepler Station, Veltar realized he had witnessed something that changed everything he thought he knew about warfare. The humans hadn't won through superior technology or brilliant strategy. They had won by being unpredictable, unreasonable, and completely willing to abandon every military tradition that other species considered sacred. The Alliance fleet celebrated their first major victory, but Veltar knew the real celebration belonged to 4 human ships that had proven chaos could triumph where order had failed. The galaxy was about to learn that there was more than one way to think about war, and the humans were just getting started. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler Station, the war was over. The Zephyrian Empire, which had seemed unstoppable for 6 months, collapsed so quickly that most observers couldn't believe what was happening. The hive mind that had conquered 73 worlds was retreating to the galaxy's outer rim, abandoning conquest after conquest in panicked flight. Veltar had watched it all happen from his observation post, recording victory after victory as human tactics spread throughout the Alliance fleet. Once other species learned to fight like humans, the Zephyrians couldn't adapt fast enough to counter the chaos. The Elthari Republic abandoned their honor codes and began using deception and surprise attacks. The Nexus Coalition stopped relying on committee decisions and started making random tactical choices. The Draconic Hegemony learned to retreat when retreat made no sense, then attack when attack seemed impossible. But it was more than just copying human methods. The other species had to learn to think like humans, and that was the hardest lesson of all. They had to accept that sometimes the best military decision was the one that made no logical sense. They had to embrace chaos as a weapon and unpredictability as a strategy. The transformation wasn't easy. Veltar watched dozens of Alliance commanders struggle with tactics that went against everything they had been taught about warfare. Many of them failed completely, unable to abandon thousands of years of military tradition. But the ones who succeeded became devastatingly effective against an enemy designed to counter logical thinking. Now, as the galaxy began to recover from the war, Veltar found himself facing a problem he had never encountered in 3 centuries of observation. For the first time, he didn't understand what he had witnessed. His carefully organized files of military doctrine seemed useless when applied to human methods of warfare. He requested a private meeting with Admiral Carter and General Foster aboard their flagship. The 2 human commanders agreed immediately, apparently curious about the Kethmori observer, who had been watching their species since first contact. The meeting took place in a simple conference room aboard the Liberty. No ceremonial weapons or ancient battle standards decorated the walls. No portraits of famous warriors or traditional military symbols. Just practical furniture and communication equipment. Even their approach to interior decoration was pragmatic rather than traditional. Commander Veltar, Admiral Carter said as they settled into their chairs. General Foster and I have been looking forward to this conversation. We understand you've been studying warfare for a very long time. 3 centuries, Veltar confirmed. I have observed conflicts between over 200 different species. I have documented weapons, strategies, tactics, and technologies from across the galaxy. But I must admit, your approach to warfare has confused all my previous analysis. General Foster smiled. Good. Confusion was part of the strategy. Veltar activated his recording equipment. I need to understand how you think about war. Every other species I have studied treats combat as an extension of their culture. The Althari fight with honor. The Nexus Coalition fights with logic. The Draconic Hegemony fights with pride. But humans seem to fight with nothing. Not nothing, Carter corrected. We fight with pragmatism. We treat war like any other problem that needs to be solved. Everything else is secondary to achieving victory. But how do you maintain unit cohesion without military tradition? How do you motivate soldiers without appeals to honor or duty? How do you make tactical decisions without logical frameworks? Foster leaned forward. You're thinking about this wrong, Commander. We do have military traditions, but we're willing to abandon them when they don't work. We do believe in honor and duty, but we don't let those beliefs get us killed. We do use logical frameworks, but we also know when to ignore logic. I don't understand the distinction. Carter stood and walked to the room's main display screen. He called up a tactical diagram showing the Battle of Kepler Station. Look at this engagement, Commander. What do you see? Veltar studied the display. I see chaos. Random movements, inconsistent weapons usage, tactical decisions that violate every principle of space combat. Exactly. Now look at it from the Zephyrian perspective. Carter changed the display to show what the enemy bioships had detected during the battle. They saw the same chaos, but they tried to find patterns anyway. Their entire adaptation process depends on identifying logical responses to predictable threats. When we gave them completely unpredictable responses, Foster continued, their adaptation process broke down. They kept trying to find logic where none existed. They kept preparing for attacks that never came and missing attacks that made no sense. Veltar began to understand. You were fighting their psychology, not their technology. Their psychology was their technology, Carter said. The hive mind's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. Perfect coordination requires predictable behavior. When we made our behavior unpredictable, their coordination became a liability. But this approach requires abandoning everything that most species consider fundamental to military science. How do you train soldiers to fight without consistent doctrine? Foster laughed. Commander, humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years before we ever reached space. We've tried every possible approach to warfare. Honor-based combat, logical strategy, technological superiority, numerical advantage. We've learned that the only constant in war is that everything changes. Our greatest military advantage, Carter added, is that we can change faster than our enemies expect. We can switch from civilized diplomacy to brutal combat in minutes. We can abandon a losing strategy without emotional attachment. We can embrace tactics that other species consider dishonorable or illogical. Veltar felt his understanding of warfare shifting in ways that made him uncomfortable. Are you saying that military tradition is a weakness? Not always, Foster replied. Tradition provides stability and motivation. But when tradition becomes more important than victory, it becomes a liability. The Zephyrians understood this. They studied every species' military traditions and used those traditions against them. The difference is that humans can compartmentalize, Carter explained. We can believe in honor and duty while still being pragmatic about tactics. We can respect our enemies while still doing whatever it takes to defeat them. We can follow military protocol in peacetime and abandon it completely during combat. This is flexibility. It's psychological rather than technological. Exactly. We don't fight wars to prove how honorable or logical we are. We fight wars to win them. Everything else is negotiable. Veltar spent the next hour asking detailed questions about human military psychology. The answers revealed a species that approached warfare with a unique combination of emotional detachment and tactical creativity. They could make decisions based on pure pragmatism, while still maintaining the social bonds necessary for effective military units. As the meeting ended, Veltar realized he needed to completely revise his understanding of what warfare meant. For 3 centuries he had focused on weapons, tactics, and strategies. But the humans had taught him that the most important factor in any conflict was the mind of the warrior. "Commander," General Foster said as they prepared to leave, "we'd like to make a suggestion. Instead of just observing human military operations, why don't you participate in some of our training exercises? You might learn more by experiencing our methods than by watching them." Veltar accepted immediately. For the first time in his career, he realized that studying war meant more than analyzing battle recordings and tactical reports. He needed to understand how warriors thought, not just how they fought. In his final report on the Zephyrian War, Veltar wrote, "I believed I understood warfare after 3 centuries of observation. I was wrong. War is not about superior weapons, better strategies, or tactical genius. War is about survival, and no species understands survival like humanity. They don't just fight wars, they redefine what war means." He closed his report with a recommendation that changed galactic military doctrine forever. Human psychological warfare methods should be studied and adapted by all species. Their approach represents a new paradigm in conflict resolution. I request permanent assignment as observer to human military forces, as my education in warfare has only just begun. The galaxy had learned that understanding war meant understanding the warrior's mind. And the human mind, it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon in the universe.